Katerina Davia is 63 years old. It is December 1932, and she is walking the same path she has walked every single day for 25 years. 1 mile from her small house in Monongah, West Virginia, to the mouth of mine number 6. 1 mile back, twice a day, every day. She carries a burlap sack, and when she reaches the mine entrance, she fills it with coal. Then she walks home and dumps it on a pile beside her house. The pile is now taller than the eaves. Somewhere between 300 and 500 tons of coal, collected one sackful at a time. Her neighbors watch her pass. They have watched her pass for a quarter century. They know why she does it. Her husband, Vittorio, is still down there, somewhere beneath 700 acres of collapsed tunnels. His body never recovered, and Katerina believes that by removing the coal piece by piece, she is lightening the weight that presses down upon him. She will continue this ritual until the day she dies. The company that killed her husband gave her $200. That was supposed to be enough. The mine that Vittorio entered on December 6, 1907, employed more men than lived in most West Virginia towns. It produced more coal than entire counties in other states. It generated more profit than its owners could spend in 10 lifetimes. And in one moment, at 10:28 on a Friday morning, it killed at least 362 men and boys, though the real number was probably closer to 500. Some were as young as 8 years old. It remains the worst industrial disaster in American history, and the company that owned it never paid a single fine. Was this the price of progress or the cost of something far uglier? The story of what happened at Monongah begins not in the mountains of West Virginia, but in the drawing rooms and boardrooms of Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and New York. By 1907, coal had become the blood of American industry. Every ton of steel required 2 tons of coal. Every mile of railroad track required coal to forge and coal to power the locomotives that ran upon it. Every factory, every foundry, every steamship, every city furnace demanded an endless river of black rock from beneath the Appalachian hills. And no coal was more valuable than the Pittsburgh seam, an 8-foot-thick layer of nearly pure carbon that ran beneath portions of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. Geologists called it the most valuable mineral deposit in the world. The men who controlled it called themselves coal barons, and they meant the term literally. They built empires. In northern West Virginia, the empire belonged to the Watson family. James Otis Watson had begun mining coal near Fairmont in 1852. The same year the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad reached the region. He was the first operator in West Virginia to ship coal by rail, and he understood before most that the railroad would transform coal from a local commodity into an industrial necessity. His son Clarence proved even more ambitious. By the time he was 30, Clarence Wayland Watson had consolidated the family's mining interests with those of his brothers and his brother-in-law, Aretas Brooks Fleming, who also happened to be a former governor of West Virginia. They brought in Senator Johnson N. Camden, a close associate of John D. Rockefeller, and together they formed the Fairmont Coal Company in 1901. Within 2 years, Fairmont Coal operated 28 mines and employed more than 6,000 men. By 1903, Clarence Watson had merged Fairmont Coal with the Consolidation Coal Company of Maryland, creating one of the largest coal operations in the nation. He became president of the combined company at the age of 39. The Monongah mines, numbers 6 and 8, were jewels in this corporate crown. The town of Monongah itself had been conjured into existence by the coal industry. Before the mines opened, the area was known as Briartown, a scattering of farms in a valley where Booth's Creek met the West Fork River. In 1891, the same year the town was officially chartered, the coal company arrived. Within a decade, Monongah had transformed into something that had no real precedent in American history, a company town. The coal company owned the houses where the miners lived. It owned the store where they bought their food and clothing. It owned the doctor who treated their injuries and the undertaker who buried their dead. It paid the town's police force. The mayor was a company manager. Members of the town council worked for the company. This was not corruption in the traditional sense. This was simply how things worked. The company was not in the town. The company was the town. The miners themselves came from everywhere and nowhere. In the early days of the Fairmont field, most workers were native West Virginians, men who had grown up farming the rocky hillsides and saw mining as a step up from subsistence agriculture. But by 1900, the demand for labor far exceeded the local supply. Company agents fanned out across Europe, recruiting workers from the poorest regions of Italy, Hungary, Poland, Russia, and the crumbling Austro-Hungarian Empire. They promised good wages, steady work, and the chance to build a new life in America. They did not mention the 10 to 12-hour days, the open flames in tunnels filled with explosive gas, or that between 1890 and 1912, West Virginia miners suffered the highest death rate in America. The immigrants arrived by the thousands. By 1907, The Monongah mines employed men who spoke more than a dozen languages. The largest single group was Italian, with especially heavy concentrations from Calabria in the far south and from the mountain towns of Molise in the central Apennines. San Giovanni in Fiore, a small commune in Calabria, sent so many of its young men to Monongah that the disaster would become permanently woven into its local dialect. To this day, when someone in San Giovanni in Fiore wants to indicate that they are not about to disappear, they say, "I am not going to Monongah." The word has entered the regional vocabulary as a synonym for catastrophe. The men from these distant villages found themselves living in a world almost beyond comprehension. Company houses lined the hillsides in rigid rows, segregated by ethnicity and status. The mine superintendent lived in a mansion with 10 to 20 rooms, surrounded by well-kept grounds and shade trees. American-born miners received the next tier of housing. Immigrants were pushed to the edges, to smaller houses near the mine entrances, or perched precariously on steep slopes. The houses had no running water, no indoor plumbing, and walls so thin that winter wind blew straight through. As many as 10 people might share a single room. The work itself was brutal. Miners were paid not by the hour but by the ton, receiving 49 cents for each ton of clean coal they extracted. This was nearly 40% less than the 76 cents per ton that unionized miners in Ohio received. But West Virginia's miners had no union. The Fairmont Ring, as the Watson-Fleming-Camden Syndicate was sometimes called, had seen to that. When the United Mine Workers attempted to organize the Fairmont Field in 1902, the company obtained injunctions, hired private guards, and crushed the effort so thoroughly that the union would not return for another 16 years. The average West Virginia coal miner earned about $2 for a 12-hour shift, roughly $58 in modern currency. Out of this came rent for the company house, deducted automatically from his wages. Out of this came bills at the company store, where prices ran 20 to 30% higher than in independent shops. Out of this came the cost of tools, lamps, blasting powder, and fuses, all purchased from the company. Out of this came fees for the company doctor, whether the miner used his services or not. Many miners discovered that after all deductions, their net pay for a month of labor was essentially zero. They worked to stay even. Children worked alongside their fathers. West Virginia law technically prohibited the employment of miners under 12, but the law was enforced with the same vigor that the state applied to mine safety regulations, which is to say, not at all. Boys as young as 8 or 9 accompanied their fathers into the tunnels, serving as helpers, door tenders, and mule drivers. They were not officially recorded on company rolls. On the morning of December 6, 1907, an unknown number of these children descended into Monongah Mines No. 6 and 8. Their names were never recorded. Their bodies were never identified. They exist now only as a statistical uncertainty, part of the gap between the official death toll of 362 and the actual toll that researchers now estimate at somewhere between 450 and 550. The two mines at Monongah were connected underground, a design decision that would prove catastrophic. Mine No. 6 entered the hillside from the east. Mine No. 8 entered from the north. Deep beneath the surface, passages from the two mines met, allowing coal to be moved through either entrance and, more significantly, allowing both mines to share a single ventilation system. This was efficient. It was cost-effective. It was also profoundly reckless. If anything happened to the shared fan house, both mines would fill with gas simultaneously. Several states had already banned the practice of connecting mines for precisely this reason. West Virginia had not. The morning of December 6, 1907 broke cold and gray over the West Virginia mountains. Friday, payday, the feast of St. Nicholas, patron saint of children, a holy day celebrated with particular devotion by the Catholic immigrants from Italy and Eastern Europe. Some miners stayed home to attend Mass. Estimates suggest that 60 to 100 men chose church over work that morning. Their faith saved their lives. The rest filed into the mine as usual. The company's official records listed 367 men entering numbers 6 and 8 that morning, but this figure was meaningless. It represented only the workers who presented their numbered brass identification tags at the entrance. It did not include the children, the brothers, cousins, and neighbors who accompanied registered miners as unofficial helpers, or anyone working off the books. The actual number of human beings who descended into the darkness that morning was somewhere between 450 and 550. No one will ever know exactly. At 10:28 in the morning, the world ended. The first explosion occurred somewhere in mine No. 8, though investigators would never determine the precise location or cause. A blown-out shot, perhaps, an electrical arc, a spark from a runaway minecar, the open flame of a miner's lamp igniting a pocket of accumulated methane. All of these explanations appeared in various reports. none was ever proven. What is certain is that a small ignition source found fuel in the coal dust that saturated the mine air. The resulting fireball expanded at unimaginable speed, racing through the passages of mine number 8 and pouring through the connections into mine number 6. On the surface, the explosion announced itself with apocalyptic violence. The concrete roof of the fan house at mine number 8 was blown to pieces. One fragment weighing more than 100 pounds landed 500 yards away. The boiler house was smashed to kindling. The ground shook so violently that residents of Monongah, half a mile away, thought an earthquake had struck. The sound reached Fairmont, 6 miles distant. Within minutes, black smoke was pouring from both mine entrances. The ventilation system had been destroyed. The 700 acres of underground workings were now filling with poison gas. The women knew immediately. Wives, mothers, sisters, daughters emerged from their company houses and ran toward the mines. They had been through this before, at other mines, in other towns. They knew what the smoke meant. They gathered at the mine entrances, and they waited, held back by company guards, and by the physical impossibility of entering tunnels filled with poison gas. In those first hours, hope persisted against all reason. Women convinced themselves that their husbands had been working in sections of the mine far from the explosion, that they had found shelter in dead-end entries where the blast hadn't reached, that rescue workers would bring them out any moment. They scanned each emerging rescue worker's face, looking for recognition, asking, "Have you seen?" and then naming their husband, their son, their father. The rescue workers, when they could, would shake their heads. When they couldn't bear to speak, they would simply look away. As the hours stretched into days, the waiting became a vigil. Women who had rushed to the mine in whatever they had been wearing when they heard the explosion now stood in the December cold, refusing to leave, refusing to go home where they might miss news. Other women brought them blankets, hot coffee, bread. Temporary shelters were erected near the mine entrances, where the families could wait out of the wind. But many women refused even this small comfort, standing as close to the mine entrance as the gods would allow, as if physical proximity might somehow pull their loved ones back to the surface. The women who maintained this vigil came from all the ethnic communities that made up Monongah. Italian women stood beside American women. Hungarian women waited with Greek women. The disaster created a temporary equality of grief that transcended the ethnic divisions the company had worked so hard to maintain. They were all doing the same thing, waiting for men who would not return, hoping against evidence, holding on to faith because the alternative was unbearable. The first rescue workers arrived within 20 minutes. Miners from nearby operations dropped their own tools and rushed to help. They had no breathing equipment, no protective gear, nothing but their own lungs and their willingness to descend into hell for their fellow workers. They could stay underground for perhaps 15 minutes at a time before the carbon monoxide forced them to retreat. Then they would gulp clean air and go back down again. The rescue effort that unfolded over the next 3 days was both heroic and heartbreaking. Men who had never met the Monongah miners risked their lives repeatedly in the slim hope that someone, anyone, might still be alive in some pocket of clean air deep in the workings. They knew the odds. They had seen mine disasters before. They understood that after the first few hours, survival became increasingly unlikely. But they went down anyway. The earliest rescue attempts were chaotic. Men rushed into the smoke-filled entrances without organization, without coordination, driven by the desperate urgency of the moment. Some collapsed from gas exposure within minutes and had to be dragged out by their companions. Others pushed deeper, calling out names, listening for responses that never came. The mine foreman tried to impose order, organizing teams and rotation schedules. But in those first hours, order was impossible. Men did what they felt they had to do. As word spread through the Fairmont coalfield, miners from other operations began to arrive. They came from Rachel, from Barrackville, from Farmington and Worthington and Montana mines. Some had friends or relatives who worked at Monongah. Others simply came because they were miners, and miners helped their own. By nightfall on December 6th, more than 200 rescue workers were on site, organized into teams that rotated through the poisoned tunnels in 15-minute shifts. The physical challenges were immense. The explosion had destroyed much of the underground infrastructure. Rail lines were twisted and blocked. Timbers had collapsed, creating obstacles that had to be cleared before rescuers could proceed. The ventilation system was completely destroyed, meaning that the mine was filling with carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide from the still-burning fires underground. Without breathing apparatus, technology that existed but was not yet widely available, rescuers had to work in atmospheres that would kill them if they stayed too long. They developed techniques through grim experience. Teams would advance into the mine until they felt the first symptoms of gas poisoning: dizziness, nausea, difficulty breathing. Then they would mark their position and retreat. The next team would advance to that mark and try to push a little further. Progress was measured in yards, sometimes in feet. Each yard gained might reveal another body, another section of collapsed tunnel, another dead end that had to be cleared before the search could continue. The bodies they found told the story of what had happened underground. Near the mine entrances, victims had been killed by the blast itself, their bodies showing massive trauma from the concussive force of the explosion. Deeper in, men had died from burns as the fireball raced through the passages. Deeper still were those who had survived the initial explosion only to suffocate as the carbon monoxide filled the mine. These men often appeared to be sleeping, seated against walls, or lying on the ground with no obvious injuries. Only when rescuers tried to wake them did they discover the truth. The most haunting discoveries were the groups. Rescuers found clusters of men who had clearly tried to help each other, pooling their remaining air, sharing water from their canteens, waiting for rescue that never came. They found fathers and sons who had died together, still touching. They found evidence that some men had survived for hours after the explosion, long enough to write farewell messages scratched into the coal with pieces of rock or metal. Most of these messages were never recovered, lost when the mines were sealed. A few were preserved, simple statements of love and regret addressed to wives and children who would never receive them. By December 8th, the fires burning deep in both mines had intensified, making rescue work even more dangerous. Smoke was now pouring from the entries in addition to the poison gas. The decision was made to seal certain sections to contain the fires, even though this meant abandoning any search in those areas. The rescuers understood what this meant. They were giving up on finding anyone alive. From that point forward, the operation was about recovering bodies, about giving families something to bury. The recovery work continued for weeks. Each day brought more bodies to the surface, each one carefully documented when identification was possible, each one added to the growing count. The task of identification fell largely to the families themselves. Women would wait at the mine entrance as bodies were brought up, then steel themselves to look at burned and broken remains, searching for some recognizable feature, some piece of clothing, some personal effect that would tell them whether this was their husband, their father, their son. Some identifications were certain: a pocket watch with an engraved name, a distinctive belt buckle, a wedding ring. Other identifications were tentative, based on body size, hair color, or the location where the remains were found. And some bodies could not be identified at all. They were too damaged, or they had been found in sections of the mine where no one could say with certainty who had been working. These unknown dead were buried in common graves, their markers bearing only numbers. The psychological toll on the rescue workers was severe. These were not professional emergency responders. They were coal miners, men who understood the dangers of underground work, but had never confronted death on this scale. They carried out the bodies of men they had known, had worked alongside, had shared meals with in the boarding houses and company houses of the coal field. They carried out boys who reminded them of their own sons. They carried out pieces of bodies, fragments that had once been whole human beings. Some rescue workers broke under the strain. They would emerge from the mine and refuse to go back down, sitting with their heads in their hands, unable to face another descent into that charnel house. No one blamed them. The foreman simply assigned them to surface duties and sent fresh volunteers underground. There was never a shortage of volunteers. For every man who reached his limit, 2 more stepped forward to take his place. The community support for the rescue workers was immediate and sustained. Women from Monongah and surrounding towns set up kitchens near the mine entrances, providing hot food and coffee around the clock. Local businesses donated supplies. The company, to its credit, provided whatever equipment and material the rescue effort required, though this generosity would not extend to meaningful compensation for the families of the dead. Churches organized prayer vigils that continued day and night. People who could do nothing else simply stood witness, their presence a silent acknowledgement of the magnitude of what was unfolding. There was almost nothing to rescue. The force of the explosion had collapsed large sections of both mines, and everywhere, in every position that could be imagined, were the bodies. Some had been killed instantly by the blast itself, their clothing ripped away, their skin burned beyond recognition. Some had been crushed by falling rocks. Some had suffocated in the toxic atmosphere, their bodies found seated or lying peacefully, as if they had simply gone to sleep. Rescue workers found men still holding their tools. They found men with their arms wrapped around their sons. On December 8th, fires broke out in both mines, adding smoke and flame to the already impossible rescue conditions. The hope that had sustained the waiting families began to die. By December 10th, the operation had officially shifted from rescue to recovery. No one else was coming out alive. The burials began while the recovery work was still ongoing. The first funerals were held on December 8th, just 2 days after the explosion, for victims who had been identified quickly and whose families had the resources to arrange immediate burial. These early services were small, private affairs, individual families grieving in whatever church or home could accommodate them. But as the days passed and more bodies were recovered, the scale of the communal mourning grew. The Catholic churches in Monongah and Fairmont held multiple masses each day. Father Andrew Manupella, the parish priest who served the Italian community, conducted funeral services from dawn until dark, sometimes celebrating Mass for 5 or 6 victims in a single day. The Protestant churches did likewise for their congregations. The sheer logistics of mourning became overwhelming. There were not enough priests, not enough preachers, not enough time to give each family the extended ritual their grief demanded. Mount Calvary Cemetery became the focal point of this mass burial. The frozen December ground made grave digging difficult, requiring picks and shovels to break through the hard earth. Professional grave diggers were supplemented by volunteers, men who worked in shifts to prepare the rows of graves that stretched along the hillside. The work was grim and exhausting, but it was also necessary. Bodies could not be kept above ground indefinitely, particularly those that had been burned or badly decomposed. The Italian section of the cemetery received the largest number of new graves, family plots that had been intended to hold multiple generations across decades, filled in a matter of days. Some families purchased multiple adjacent plots to ensure that fathers and sons, brothers and cousins could lie together in death as they had died together underground. Other families, lacking the money for individual graves, buried their dead in common plots, marked with simple wooden crosses that listed multiple names. The funeral processions became a daily feature of life in Monongah. Black-clad widows walked behind wagons carrying rough wooden coffins. Children, some too young to fully understand what had happened, followed their mothers. The entire community turned out for these processions, lining the streets in silent witness. The traditional wailing of Italian women in mourning, the keening that was part of their cultural expression of grief, echoed through the valley. It was a sound that those who heard it would remember for the rest of their lives. Some families chose to ship their dead back to Italy for burial in family plots in the villages where they had been born. This was expensive, requiring embalmment, a sealed casket, and transportation costs that could exceed a year's wages. Only the families with substantial savings or access to loans could afford it. Approximately 30 bodies were eventually shipped back across the Atlantic, a final journey home for men who had left seeking prosperity and found only death. For the unidentified dead, the question of burial was even more complex. Without confirmed identities, these victims could not be buried in family plots or claimed by relatives. They were interred in a section of Mount Calvary, set aside for the unknown, their graves marked with numbers corresponding to the order in which their bodies had been recovered. Some of these graves would eventually receive names as families made tentative identifications based on circumstantial evidence. The location where the body was found, the approximate age and build, the few personal effects that might have survived, but many would remain forever anonymous, known only to God, and remembered only in the aggregate count of the dead. The psychological impact on the community was profound and long-lasting. Every family in Monongah had lost someone, if not a husband or father or son, then a neighbor, a boarder, a friend. The town had been built around the mine, and the mine had killed a significant portion of its adult male population in a single morning. The social fabric was torn beyond easy repair. Women who had been neighbors suddenly found themselves in competition for the same scarce opportunities for wage work. Children who had played together now faced vastly different futures, some with surviving fathers who could provide, others orphaned and facing the likelihood of child labor or institutional care. The boarding houses that had been full of single miners now had vacancies that would never be filled, because the immigrant workers who might have occupied them were dead or had fled to other coal fields where the memory of Monongah was not so fresh. The outside world learned of the disaster through newspaper headlines that grew more terrible with each edition. All hope is gone, read the Fairmont Times on December 7th. The New York Times reported estimates of 1,000 dead. For many Americans, this was their first awareness that such places as Monongah existed, that thousands of men labored in such conditions, that the coal powering their railroads and heating their homes came at such a price in human lives. The response from Fairmont Coal Company President Clarence Watson was swift and predictable. Speaking to reporters on December 7th, Watson claimed that the explosion could only have been caused by the careless use of a mining lamp by one of the workers themselves. The company had done everything possible to ensure safe operations. The tragedy was an act of God, perhaps, or the fault of the immigrants who did not understand proper safety procedures. In any case, It was certainly not the responsibility of the company. The coroner's inquest that followed told a different story, though it was carefully worded. The jury found that the company had complied with the mining laws of the state. This was technically true. West Virginia's mining laws were so weak as to be essentially meaningless. The actual death toll remained a matter of contention. The West Virginia Department of Mines listed 362 victims in its 1908 annual report, and this became the official number. But the checkboard at the mine entrance had been destroyed in the explosion. Many workers had never been properly registered in the first place. Children and unofficial helpers had no tags at all. Bodies were recovered in pieces, making individual identification often impossible. Some remains were never recovered at all. Later researchers, working from relief fund records, church registries, and Italian government documents, have concluded that the actual death toll was somewhere between 450 and 550. The victims left behind devastation that rippled outward in every direction. Official records documented 216 women widowed and 475 children orphaned, with an additional 31 children born in the months after the disaster to fathers who had died in the mine. One contemporary account noted that not one man remained in 27 of the 30 households on a single block in Monongah. Entire extended families had been wiped out. 10 members of the DeSalvo family died that morning. The youngest, Fiorangelo DeSalvo, was 12 years old and had immigrated from Duronia, Molise, just 1 year earlier. The Monongah Mines Relief Committee organized immediately to coordinate assistance. Over 2,000 newspapers across the country promoted fundraising efforts. Andrew Carnegie, whose steel mills consumed vast quantities of coal, contributed generously. In total, approximately $150,000 was raised. Each widow received $200. Each orphan under 16 received $155. The Fairmont Coal Company itself contributed $17,500 to the relief fund, roughly $48 per victim. This was the extent of the company's financial liability. No lawsuits succeeded, no executives faced criminal charges, no fines were ever assessed. The widows of Monongah faced impossible choices. Most had no legal right to work in the mines, no skills marketable in the outside economy, and no resources to relocate. They could not read or write English. Many could not read or write at all. They were strangers in a foreign land, suddenly alone, with small children to feed. The $200 provided to each widow by the relief fund was supposed to sustain a family for several months, perhaps a year, if supplemented by work. In practice, it lasted weeks. The company store continued to charge the same inflated prices. Rent on the company houses was due monthly, though many widows received temporary forbearance. Fuel, food, clothing, medicine, all the necessities of survival cost money that the widows did not have and had no legal way to earn an amount sufficient to support a family. Some widows took in washing, scrubbing other families' clothes on washboards for a few cents per load. The work destroyed their hands, left them bent and exhausted, and paid barely enough to buy flour. Others became seamstresses, if they had the skill, taking in piecework that paid by the garment. A woman might sew for 12 hours to earn 50 cents, working by lamplight until her eyes watered and her fingers cramped. The best paid work available to women was operating as boarding house keepers, providing meals and laundry service to unmarried minors. This required a large enough house to accommodate multiple boarders, enough capital to purchase food in bulk, and the physical stamina to cook 3 meals a day for 5 or 6 men while also maintaining the house and caring for one's own children. Maria Marinelli, who lost her husband Francesco and her son Giuseppe in the explosion, ran a boarding house that housed 8 minors. She rose at 4 in the morning to prepare breakfast, then packed lunch pails while the men ate. After they left for their shift, she cleaned the house, did laundry, and prepared dinner. The boarders paid $3 per week each for room and meals. Out of the $24 this brought in monthly, half went to food costs, a quarter to rent and fuel, leaving perhaps $6 profit, exactly what her husband had earned in 3 days underground. She worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, to maintain a subsistence her husband had achieved in half that time. The orphans presented an even more desperate problem. Children under 16 received $155 from the relief fund, a one-time payment that was expected to last until they could work. For a 10-year-old, this meant the money had to stretch 6 years. It was impossible. Orphans were distributed among relatives when possible. Widowed mothers with too many children to feed sometimes sent the older ones to live with married siblings or cousins in other mining towns. The very young might be taken in by childless couples. The unlucky ended up in state institutions, where conditions ranged from merely harsh to genuinely brutal. But the most common solution to the orphan problem was child labor. Boys who had lost their fathers at 11 or 12 entered the mines as soon as they could pass for the legal minimum age of 12. No one examined birth certificates closely. A boy who could push a mine car or open ventilation doors could work, and a working boy could feed himself and contribute to his widowed mother's household. The law that prohibited child labor was enforced with the same enthusiasm as the law that mandated mine safety inspections, which is to say, not at all. Girls faced different but equally limited options. They could marry young, sometimes to men decades older who needed housekeepers more than wives. They could work as domestic servants in the homes of mine supervisors or in the few middle-class households in Fairmont. They could help their mothers with washing and sewing. What they could not do was acquire education or training that might lead to better prospects. Schools in company towns were minimal, often holding classes only a few months per year, and girls were pulled out first when household needs demanded their labor. Some families disintegrated entirely under the pressure. Mothers who could not cope with the loss of a husband and the responsibility of children alone simply broke. They retreated into silence, into depression, into illnesses both physical and mental. Their children were parceled out to whoever would take them. Records from the period show several Monongah widows who were committed to the state asylum in Weston within a year of the disaster. The official diagnoses were vague: melancholia, nervous exhaustion, female troubles. The actual cause was grief compounded by poverty and hopelessness. The company's position on widow relief was that it had fulfilled its legal obligations by contributing to the relief fund. Fairmont Coal was not responsible for the long-term support of workers' families. It had paid its share. The fact that this share amounted to roughly $48 per dead miner, less than a month's wages, was not the company's concern. The fact that the company continued to collect rent from widows living in company houses, continued to charge inflated prices at the company store, continued to profit from the labor of orphaned sons who replaced their dead fathers underground. None of this struck company management as contradictory or cruel. It was simply business. Some turned their company houses into boarding houses. Some found work as seamstresses or laundresses. Some sent their surviving sons, boys of 10 or 11, into the same mines that had killed their fathers. Caterina de Carlo da Villa, whose story would later inspire the memorial statue called the Heroine of Monongah, attempted to return to her home in the Dolomites with her 5 children, only to find famine conditions that forced her back to West Virginia within months. Caterina de Villa's response to her husband's death became legendary precisely because it was so unusual. Most widows adapted to their loss through the practical necessities of survival. They mourned, certainly, but they could not afford to mourn exclusively. They had children to feed and houses to maintain and bills to pay. Grief was a luxury, something to be experienced in stolen moments between work and sleep. Davia refused this adaptation. She maintained her household, raised her children, did what was necessary to survive. But she also walked to the mine entrance every day, filled her burlap sack with coal from the waste pile, and carried it home. The pile beside her house grew year by year, a monument to persistence, a physical manifestation of grief that would not be confined to stolen moments. She was carrying her husband out of the mine, piece by piece, in the only way available to her. The other widows understood. Some thought her mad, some thought her admirable. All recognized that she was doing what they wished they could do, refusing to accept the unacceptable, insisting on presence even in the face of permanent absence, maintaining connection to the dead when everyone else demanded that she move on. She would spend the next 25 years walking to that mine entrance, bucket in hand. She never reached her husband, but she never stopped trying. The disaster at Monongah did not occur in isolation. December 1907 would become known as Black December in American mining history. On December 1st, an explosion at the Naomi Mine in Fayette County, Pennsylvania, killed 34 men. On December 16th, the Yolande Mine in Alabama exploded, killing 57. On December 19th, just 13 days after Monongah, the Dar Mine in Rostraver Township, Pennsylvania, exploded, killing 239, including many children. In total, at least 700 miners died in explosions that single month. For the year 1907 as a whole, the official death toll in American coal mines reached 3,241, the highest annual total in the nation's history. The international dimension of the disaster became clearer in the weeks that followed. Italian newspapers reported the catastrophe in detail, shocking readers who had believed their sons and husbands were prospering in America. The Italian government received queries from dozens of towns and villages seeking information about specific men. Consular officials in Philadelphia and New York were overwhelmed with requests from families desperate to know if their relatives had survived. The response from Italy was complicated by the fact that the Italian government had actively encouraged emigration to the United States. Overpopulation, agricultural failure, and limited economic opportunities had made emigration from southern Italy not just common but necessary. Government policy had been to facilitate this exodus, seeing it as a relief valve for social pressures that might otherwise produce revolution. Now, confronted with the deaths of nearly 200 Italian citizens in a single industrial disaster, the government faced uncomfortable questions about whether it had essentially exported its surplus population to die in American mines. Some Italian politicians called for restrictions on emigration to dangerous occupations. Others demanded that the Italian government negotiate safety protections for Italian workers in America. Still others argued that Italy should provide direct financial assistance to the families of the dead. None of these proposals came to fruition. The Italian government sent condolences, expressed regret, and continued to issue passports to young men seeking work in American coal mines. The fundamental economic pressures that drove emigration had not changed, and those pressures overrode moral concerns about worker safety. In the villages that had lost multiple sons, the impact was profound and lasting. San Giovanni and Fiore experienced what amounted to a demographic catastrophe. Nearly 30 men from this single commune died at Monongah. In a town of perhaps 5,000 residents, this represented a significant portion of the working-age male population. Families that had counted on remittances from America suddenly found themselves without that income. Women who had been waiting for their fiancés to send for them received letters saying their intended husbands were dead. The disaster rippled backward across the Atlantic, creating a secondary wave of grief and economic dislocation in communities that had already been struggling. The linguistic legacy in San Giovanni and Fiore, the adoption of Monongah as a synonym for catastrophe, reflects how deeply the disaster penetrated local consciousness. Languages preserve memories that individuals forget. When a disaster becomes a word, it achieves a kind of permanence that outlasts personal grief. Children born decades after 1907 grew up hearing their grandparents use Monongah to describe any sudden, total loss. The word carried in it the weight of all those young men who had left seeking fortune and found only death in the West Virginia darkness. The cumulative horror finally moved the federal government to action, though that action remained limited. President Theodore Roosevelt urged Congress to create a federal agency that could investigate mine accidents and develop safety research. The Bureau of Mines was established in 1910, but its authority extended only to research and investigation. It had no power to set standards, conduct inspections, or enforce regulations. The Bureau could study disasters after they happened. It could not prevent the next explosion. The investigation into the Monongah disaster itself revealed a catalog of failures. The state mine inspector, who was supposed to have examined both mines within the previous 6 months, claimed to have found no serious violations. His report, filed weeks before the explosion, noted adequate ventilation, proper timbering, and satisfactory safety conditions. Either he had conducted the most cursory inspection imaginable, or he had simply filed a pro forma document without entering the mine at all. No one was ever held accountable for this failure. The physical evidence told a different story. When Bureau of Mines investigators finally gained access to the wreckage, they found ventilation systems that had been poorly maintained, air courses clogged with debris, and dust accumulations that should have been watered down or removed. They found evidence of blown-out shots in multiple locations, suggesting that blasting procedures were haphazard at best. They found that the practice of connecting the two mines had created a single unified explosion chamber, ensuring that ignition anywhere in either mine would propagate throughout both. Most damningly, they found that the fan system serving both mines was housed in a wooden structure that had been destroyed in the initial blast. Modern practice, already adopted in some states, required fan houses to be built of fireproof materials and located at a distance from mine entrances to protect them from explosion damage. The Fairmont Coal Company had built a wooden fan house directly adjacent to one of the mine openings. When the explosion occurred, it destroyed the very system that might have allowed rescue workers to ventilate the mine and save survivors. The technical recommendations that emerged from the investigation read like a catalog of measures the company should have implemented years earlier. Rock dust, the tunnels to prevent coal dust explosions, maintain separate ventilation for separate mines, build fireproof fan houses at safe distances, use electric lamps instead of open flames, test for gas before each shift, These were not revolutionary concepts. They were established best practices that the company had chosen not to follow because doing so cost money. But federal investigators had no power to compel implementation of their recommendations. They could publish reports. They could cite Monongah as an example of what happened when safety measures were ignored. They could develop better ventilation systems and safer blasting techniques. What they could not do was force a single coal company to adopt any of these improvements. That power remained with state governments, and in West Virginia, the state government remained firmly controlled by the coal operators themselves. The company barely paused. Both mines eventually returned to full production. The Fairmont Coal Company merged into the larger Consolidation Coal Company in 1909, and Clarence Watson continued as president, later serving as chairman until 1928. He became one of the wealthiest men in West Virginia. He served briefly in the United States Senate. He bred champion show horses at his family estate and won awards at competitions in both America and Europe. His miners were named in lists that families kept folded in Bibles and church registries because the company had never bothered to record them properly. What changed in the aftermath of Monongah was not the law or the industry, but the awareness of the American public. The scale of the disaster, the international attention it received, and the subsequent investigations created a record that could not be erased. People who had never thought about where their coal came from now understood, however dimly, that it came from places like Monongah and from men like those who died there. To understand what was truly lost at Monongah requires looking closely at the daily reality these men faced. A miner would rise before dawn to a breakfast of bread and coffee if the family could afford it. The thin walls of the company houses offered little insulation. Many families rationed their heating coal, letting the fire die overnight and shivering until morning. Work in the mines demanded specific skills acquired through brutal experience. Cutting coal began with undercutting the seam, lying on one side and swinging a pick at the base of the coal wall to create a deep horizontal groove. This holing was backbreaking labor performed in a position no human body was designed to maintain for hours. Only after the undercut was complete would the miner drill holes for blasting. Black powder was the standard explosive in 1907. If everything went correctly, the explosion would shatter the coal and drop it into the open space created by the undercut. If something went wrong, the result was a blown-out shot. The uncontained flame could ignite accumulated gas or dust. Loading the blasted coal was equally exhausting. Loaders shoveled broken coal into wooden cars, separating clean coal from worthless rock and slate. The company employed check weighmen who inspected each car, notorious for finding reasons to reduce a miner's credited tonnage. The hazards went far beyond explosions. Roof falls killed more miners than any other single cause. The ceiling of a coal mine was a jumbled layer of shale, sandstone, and clay, held in place by friction and occasional wooden timbers. A falling rock slab could weigh hundreds of pounds and gave no warning. The air itself was a killer. Coal dust filled lungs, creating black lung disease that destroyed breathing capacity. Methane seeped continuously from the coal seam, accumulating in pockets where a single flame could trigger disaster. The Fairmont Coal Company's safety record before Monongah suggests that production mattered very much and safety mattered very little. West Virginia's mining laws required adequate ventilation and precautions against explosive gas, but these requirements were enforced by a small corps of state mine inspectors who were hopelessly outnumbered and politically compromised. The practice of connecting mines, which proved so catastrophic at Monongah, was a direct result of this regulatory failure. Maintaining separate ventilation systems cost money. Connecting them saved money. The additional risk was a problem for the miners, not for the company. The miners themselves understood these dangers better than anyone. They developed superstitions and rituals. The Italian miners at Monongah were particularly devoted to their saints, especially Saint Nicholas, whose feast day fell on December 6. The decision by dozens of miners to attend Mass that morning was an act of faith in forces greater than the company. The company did not share this perspective. To the men in Baltimore and Pittsburgh who owned the stock and received the dividends, the miners were simply a cost of production. When one died, another took his place. The immigrant communities that supplied this endless stream of labor were seen not as collections of human beings with families and hopes, but as populations to be managed and utilized. The specific cause of the Monongah explosion was never definitively determined, but focusing on the immediate cause misses the larger truth. The explosion was inevitable. The mine required adequate ventilation, dust control, proper explosive training, gas testing, and separated mines. The Fairmont Coal Company did none of these things adequately. These failures were not oversights, they were choices. Each safety measure cost money. Each expenditure reduced profits. The company calculated that implementing comprehensive safety measures exceeded the cost of occasional disasters. This is the logic of industrial capitalism when unrestrained by regulation. If protecting workers' lives costs more than replacing them, protection becomes economically irrational. This does not mean Clarence Watson was a monster. He was a successful businessman operating within the rules of his time. He followed the law. He met his contractual obligations. By the standards of his era, he was a pillar of the community. And by those same standards, blaming victims and denying responsibility was normal business practice. The reaction of broader society to Monongah reveals how deeply these attitudes were embedded. There was shock and sympathy, but also a widespread sense that mining disasters were simply part of the natural order. The idea that specific decisions by specific individuals had created the conditions for catastrophe was present, but muted. The idea that those individuals should face legal consequences was virtually absent. Compare this to the Upper Big Branch mine explosion in 2010. When it killed 29 miners in West Virginia, the Mine Safety and Health Administration issued 369 citations and assessed penalties of nearly $11 million. The CEO of Massey Energy was eventually convicted of a criminal offense. The company paid more than $200 million in settlements. This was still woefully inadequate, but it was orders of magnitude more accountability than the Fairmont Coal Company ever faced. The difference reflects more than a century of struggle to establish that corporations can be held responsible for killing their workers. Every safety regulation was fought for by workers, unions, reformers, and families of the dead. The coal industry resisted every step, arguing that regulation was unnecessary and that government interference would destroy jobs. It made these arguments after Monongah. It makes them today. The miners of Monongah died before this struggle truly began, but their deaths helped create the political conditions for reforms that followed. This is a bitter form of legacy. They did not intend to become martyrs. They intended to earn a living and support their families. Instead, they became a data point in the long history of industrial carnage that eventually moved the American conscience toward action. The solidarity that might have developed from shared danger was systematically suppressed by company policy. The Fairmont Coal Company divided workers by ethnicity, language, and status. Italian miners lived in one section of town, Hungarians in another, native-born Americans in a third. This wasn't accidental. Company managers understood that workers who couldn't communicate with each other, who saw themselves as competitors for scarce jobs, who harbored old country prejudices against other nationalities, would never unite to demand better conditions. The ethnic divisions were reinforced by differential treatment. American miners received better housing assignments, better positions in the mine, and were more likely to be promoted to supervisory roles. They earned the same per-ton rate as immigrants, but they were assigned to richer seams and given first choice of working locations. Immigrants got what was left: the dangerous faces, the difficult cuts, the areas with bad air or unstable roofs. When production bonuses were distributed, Americans received them. When discipline was imposed, it fell on immigrants. Language barriers compounded the problem. Safety instructions, such as they were, came in English. Warning signs were in English. Company rules were posted in English. An Italian miner who couldn't read English, and most couldn't, worked blind, dependent on older workers to translate and explain. This made them vulnerable to exploitation and more likely to be injured or killed. The company made no effort to provide multilingual safety information. The cost of translation was not worth the lives it might save. Yet despite these divisions, moments of cross-ethnic solidarity did occur. When the United Mine Workers attempted to organize the Fairmont field in 1902, it was immigrant workers who proved most receptive. They had less to lose than American miners, who might hope for advancement within the company system. The immigrants knew they would never be promoted, never be favored, never be anything but disposable labor. They understood that organization was their only protection. Mother Jones understood this too. When she came to West Virginia in 1901, she spoke to mixed crowds of American, Italian, Hungarian, and Slavic miners. She told them in language they could understand, even when translators were required, that the companies kept them divided because unity meant power. She called them brothers, regardless of where they were born. She said that capital had no nationality, and neither should labor. The 1902 organizing drive failed, crushed by legal injunctions and company violence. But the seed had been planted. The miners who heard Mother Jones speak carried her message. They whispered it to newcomers. They taught it to their sons. And when disaster struck at Monongah, the response demonstrated that ethnic divisions could break down in the face of shared tragedy. The rescue workers who descended into the poisoned mine to search for survivors came from all backgrounds. American miners worked alongside Italians. Hungarians helped carry out the bodies of Greeks. The disaster revealed what the company had worked so hard to hide, that the men underground had far more in common with each other than with the men who owned the mine. This realization did not immediately translate into successful organization. The Fairmont field remained non-union until 1918, but the memory of Monongah, the knowledge that 362 men had died under conditions that could have been prevented, became part of the case for unionization. When organizers returned after World War I, they could point to the disaster and ask, how many more must die before we stand together? The answer came slowly. The United Mine Workers finally won recognition in the Fairmont field in 1918, partly because wartime labor shortages gave workers unprecedented leverage, partly because the federal government briefly supported unionization as necessary to maintain coal production for the war effort. Clarence Watson, who had fought the union for 2 decades, finally agreed to negotiate. The contract that resulted guaranteed union recognition, established grievance procedures, and created the first formal safety committee with worker representation. These gains were significant but limited. The company retained control over most aspects of mine operation. Wages increased only marginally. Safety improvements came slowly. But for the first time, miners had a voice. They could challenge unsafe conditions without facing immediate dismissal. They could demand investigations when accidents occurred. They could insist that the company follow its own safety rules. The union also provided practical support that the company never had. When miners were injured, the union helped them navigate compensation claims. When they were blacklisted, the union found them work in other fields. When they died, the union ensured their families received whatever benefits were available and fought for more. The United Mine Workers became not just a bargaining agent, but a mutual aid society, providing the collective support that individual workers could never achieve on their own. This transformation did not happen because of the disaster at Monongah alone. It happened because of decades of struggle, thousands of smaller fights, and the cumulative weight of industrial death that finally became too heavy for society to ignore. But Monongah was part of that weight. The 362 dead added their mass to the scale. Their deaths, meaningless in themselves, acquired meaning through the use others made of them. The memorial that exists in Monongah today was a long time coming. The first marker did not appear until 1961, more than half a century after the explosion. But the major commemorations did not begin until the centennial in 2007, when the community finally assembled the resources and will to acknowledge what had happened. The Monongah heroine statue, dedicated to the widows, stands in the town square depicting a mother holding a baby with a young child beside her. The model was Katerina Davia, the woman who spent 25 years carrying coal from the mine entrance to her yard. The Carrara marble from which the statue is carved was a gift from Italy. So was the bell that now hangs in the town square, presented by the region of Molise on the 100th anniversary. In 2009, the President of Italy conferred the Star of Merit for Labor upon all the victims, a belated recognition that came more than 100 years too late. The town of Monongah itself survived, barely. The mines closed eventually, and with them went the reason for the town's existence. The population that once numbered in the thousands has dwindled to fewer than 1,000. The median household income hovers around $54,000. Below the national average. The poverty rate approaches 20%. The town that was built to extract coal now extracts very little of anything, but Monongah's legacy extends far beyond the town limits. The disaster became a reference case in Bureau of Mine Studies, cited repeatedly in arguments for improved safety procedures. The public outrage it generated contributed to the slow progress toward federal mine safety legislation that culminated in the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969, passed after the Farmington explosion killed 78 miners in 1968. That law finally gave federal authorities the power to inspect mines, set safety standards, and impose meaningful penalties. David McAteer, who wrote the definitive history of the Monongah disaster, helped draft the 1969 legislation and later served as Assistant Secretary for Mine Safety and Health. In 2010, when the Upper Big Branch explosion killed 29 miners, Governor Joe Manchin asked McAteer to lead the independent investigation. The connections form a line stretching more than a century. The specific technical innovations that emerged from studying Monongah saved countless lives in subsequent decades. The practice of rock dusting, coating mine surfaces with pulverized limestone to prevent coal dust from igniting, became standard in American mines, largely because Bureau of Mines researchers used Monongah as their prime example of what happened without it. The development of flame safety lamps that could detect methane without providing an ignition source was accelerated by the recognition that open flame lamps had likely triggered the Monongah explosion. The requirement that mines maintain separate ventilation systems rather than connecting multiple mines to a single fan was written into the mining codes of multiple states in direct response to Monongah. Pennsylvania banned the practice in 1909. Ohio followed in 1910. West Virginia itself did not prohibit connected ventilation until 1919, more than a decade after the disaster, but the ban eventually came. Each of these regulatory changes represented a battle won against industry opposition, and in each case, reformers could point to Monongah as proof of why the change was necessary. The development of self-rescue breathing devices for miners, small oxygen supplies that could sustain a trapped worker long enough to reach safety, was partly motivated by the knowledge that some Monongah victims had survived the initial explosion but suffocated while waiting for rescue. Modern self-contained self-rescuers, required equipment in American coal mines since the 1970s, might have saved dozens of lives at Monongah if they had existed in 1907. Similarly, the modern practice of maintaining detailed mine maps showing the exact location of every working face, every air course, every escape route emerged from the chaos of the Monongah rescue effort, where rescuers often didn't know where to search because the company's maps were outdated or inaccurate. Federal regulations now require that mine maps be updated continuously and made available to rescue workers in case of emergency. The principle of independent mine safety inspection, free from company influence, also traces its lineage to Monongah. The state mine inspector, who had certified the Monongah mines as safe just weeks before the explosion, was widely understood to be compromised by his relationships with coal operators. The Bureau of Mines was created partly to provide genuinely independent safety assessment. Though it lacked enforcement power until 1969, its existence represented a recognition that companies could not be trusted to regulate themselves. Even the modern system of mine rescue teams, specialized groups trained in underground emergency response and equipped with proper breathing apparatus, developed in response to disasters like Monongah, where willing volunteers risked death because they lacked proper equipment and training. The first formal mine rescue station in the United States was established by the Bureau of Mines in Pittsburgh in 1910, just 3 years after Monongah, specifically to train rescue teams and develop better rescue equipment. The Upper Big Branch disaster proved that the lessons of Monongah remained only partially learned. The mine was operated by Massey Energy under CEO Don Blankenship, who had made his fortune cutting costs and fighting safety regulations. The mine had received more than 1,300 safety citations in the 5 years before the explosion. The explosion was caused by a buildup of methane and coal dust, the same combination that destroyed Monongah 103 years earlier. The independent investigation concluded that the deaths were entirely preventable. Blankenship was convicted of conspiracy to violate federal mine safety standards. He served 1 year in prison, 1 year for 29 dead miners. The pattern repeats itself across American industrial history. Disaster, outrage, legislation, enforcement that weakens as memories fade. Then another disaster, and the cycle begins again. The miners of Monongah died in 1907 because governments refused to regulate effectively. The miners of Upper Big Branch died in 2010 because federal authorities had been captured by the industries they were supposed to regulate, and because company executives had decided that compliance with safety regulations was optional. The victims came from dozens of towns and villages across 2 continents. The Italian dead hailed primarily from 2 regions. From Molise in central Italy came men from Duronia, Agnone, Castelmauro, and Trevento. These were mountain towns where farming had become impossible for younger sons, where land inheritance laws meant that only the eldest could marry and stay, where emigration was not an opportunity, but a necessity. From Calabria in the south came workers from San Giovanni in Fiore, a commune so devastated by the loss that local historians estimate 1 in every 12 families lost a member at Monongah. The Hungarian contingent included both ethnic Magyars and Slovaks from the northern reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many came from mining regions in present-day Slovakia, where they had learned underground work in European coal and metal mines before seeking better wages in America. The Russians were largely not Russian at all, but Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews from the western provinces of the Russian Empire, fleeing both poverty and periodic pogroms. The Greek and Turkish workers represented the tail end of immigration from the Ottoman Empire, though by 1907 most Turkish miners were actually Greeks from Anatolia or Armenians fleeing persecution. The American dead included sons of the original settlers, men whose families had worked these hills for generations. They were the skilled craftsmen, the shot firers, the track layers, the men who knew English and could read the company notices and understand the foreman's instructions. They occupied a privileged position in the mine's hierarchy, yet they died alongside the immigrants they had been taught to see as inferior. Charles Edward Reinhardt, 35, left behind a wife and 4 children. Perry Mayle, 27, was found with his brother William, 24, their bodies so close that rescue workers initially thought they had been trying to protect each other. James Hornick, an Austrian immigrant who had lived in Monongah for 15 years and was considered practically American, died with his 14-year-old son Andrew, who should not have been in the mine at all. The youngest verified victim was Jacob Vogel, age 12, though there were almost certainly younger boys whose presence was never officially recorded. The oldest was Francesco Marinelli, who had celebrated his 60th birthday just 2 weeks before the explosion. Between these extremes lay fathers and sons, brothers and cousins, neighbors who had traveled together from the same Italian village, Hungarians who had known each other in the old country and reunited in the West Virginia mountains. Some families lost multiple generations in a single morning. The Fornari family from San Giovanni in Fiore lost Pasquale, 42, and his sons Giuseppe, 16, and Antonio, 14. The Masiti family lost Pietro, 47, along with his nephew Domenico, 22. 3 Shuttlesworth brothers, Edgar, 25, Lawrence, 23, and Ernest, 21, died together, leaving their mother, a widow who had already buried her husband in a mine accident 5 years earlier, with no surviving sons. The town of Monongah still holds annual commemorations in early December. Descendants gather at Mount Calvary Cemetery, where rows of simple markers stretch along the hillside. Some graves bear names, many bear only numbers or nothing at all. The remains were often incomplete, assembled from pieces found in different sections of the mine, identified by scraps of clothing rather than by recognizable features. Families who could afford it shipped bodies back to Italy. Families who could not buried their dead in the cold West Virginia earth. The memory was nearly lost. For decades after the disaster, Monongah was simply another dying coal town, its history overshadowed by more famous labor conflicts. The surviving families kept their stories among themselves. The company kept no commemorations. Only in the 21st century did the combination of historical research, Italian-American community organizing, and the human desire to remember the dead finally produce the memorials that now stand in Monongah. Today, if you visit the town, you can see the heroine statue in the square. You can hear the bell from Molise ring on the anniversary. You can climb the hillside to Mount Calvary and walk among the graves. What you cannot see are the mines themselves. The entrances were sealed long ago. The tunnels have collapsed or flooded or been abandoned to the darkness. Somewhere beneath the West Virginia hills, in passages no living person has entered for decades, lie the remains of men whose bodies were never recovered. The mine operators of 1907 believed they were building an industrial civilization that would last forever. They believed the coal would never run out, and the workers would never organize, and the government would never regulate, and the profits would flow eternally. They were wrong about all of it. The coal is still there, much of it, but the economics have shifted. Natural gas, automation, environmental regulations, and declining demand have reduced West Virginia's coal employment from hundreds of thousands to fewer than 20,000. What remains constant is the danger. Mining coal is safer today than it was in 1907, incomparably safer by any statistical measure. But miners still die. Equipment fails, methane accumulates, roofs collapse. In 2006, the Sago mine explosion in West Virginia killed 12 miners. In 2010, Upper Big Branch killed 29. The numbers are smaller, the disasters less frequent, but they continue. The coal that powered the American Industrial Revolution was paid for in lives. It was paid for by the 362 who died at Monongah, and the 239 who died at Dar, and the thousands who died in accidents that never made headlines because they took lives 1 or 2 at a time. It was paid for by the miners who survived explosions but died slowly of black lung, their breath growing shorter year by year. It was paid for by the widows who raised children alone on nothing, and the children who went into the mines at 10 because their families needed the money. This was the bargain. We wanted cheap energy, and someone had to pay the difference between what we were willing to spend and what that energy actually cost. The someone was men like those who died at Monongah, and women like Caterina Davia, and children whose names were never recorded because no one thought they mattered enough to write down. The mines at Monongah are silent now. The tunnels have filled with water and the entries have been sealed. But the story of what happened there on December 6, 1907, continues to echo through American history. It echoes in every mine safety regulation that has ever been written. It echoes in every debate about the appropriate role of government in protecting workers from the industries that employ them. It echoes in every calculation about the true cost of the energy we consume. The memorial bell in Monongah's town square was cast to be heard. It rings not as a funeral toll, but as a call to attention. Pay attention, it says, to what happened here. Pay attention to why it happened. Pay attention to what has changed and what has not. We have changed the system somewhat. We have imposed regulations and penalties and oversight mechanisms that did not exist in 1907. We have granted workers rights that the miners of Monongah could not imagine claiming. But we have not transformed the underlying logic. The market still rewards cost-cutting. Shareholders still demand returns. Companies still face pressure to minimize expenses, including safety expenses. The regulations exist because we impose them, and they persist only as long as we maintain them. They can be weakened, circumvented, eliminated. They are not laws of nature but choices of society, and choices can always be changed. The choice is ongoing. The forces that opposed safety regulation in 1907 still oppose it today. They use different arguments, invoke different principles, cite different economic studies, but the underlying logic is the same. Regulation costs money. The calculus that made sense to the Fairmont Coal Company still makes sense to corporations that operate on principles of profit maximization regardless of human cost. The difference is that we now know as a society that we are making this calculation. We know that when we weaken safety regulations, when we reduce inspection budgets, when we make it harder for workers to report violations, we are choosing to let more workers die. We cannot claim ignorance. The history of places like Monongah has been documented, studied, commemorated. Whether we choose to learn from it is another matter. The bell in Monongah rings on December 6th each year. It rings for the dead. It rings for the living. It rings as a reminder that the choice between these two categories is not predetermined, not inevitable, not outside human control. It rings because someone decided it should ring, because communities organized to erect memorials, and historians work to preserve the records that make remembrance possible. It rings because Caterina Davia walked to the mine every day for 25 years, refusing to let her husband be forgotten. That bell will keep ringing as long as there are people who choose to ring it. What happens in the mines, in the factories, in all the workplaces where human beings exchange their labor for wages, depends on what the rest of us choose to do with the warning it provides. 362 men and boys went underground on the morning of December 6, 1907. None of them came back.